Oh, gosh. I was working in the Ohio Attorney General's office. I was the press secretary. We were responsible for the office's image. And one of the lawyers said something he shouldn't have said to a reporter. Somebody said, well, you should talk to the senior staff. The big senior staff meeting is next week. And so I came loaded with bear, and I gave less of a presentation than just a rant. And it was silly because I made so many mistakes. I didn't plan. I winged it. I was too emotional. I joked around. It was a very serious topic. And I think I joked because I was probably not confident in my message. So my boss's boss grabbed me by the arm. She was the chief of staff, and she said, you are really bad at this. You need to take some public speaking classes. So ironically, I've never taken a public speaking class, and now I give them.
You're listening to The Creative Impostor, episode number 83. Welcome to The Creative Impostor, episode number 83. Today I am talking with Rob Biesenbach. And you know when you are doing one thing at one certain time in your life and you meet all these people who are a part of that thing, and then you stop doing that thing and you kind of lose touch with those people? Well, that's what happened with me and Rob Biesenbach. But then I started doing this new thing, connected with Rob, got on LinkedIn, found Rob's content there, and was like, oh, here's this other thing. What on earth am I talking about? So I met Rob Biesenbach many years ago when I was the artistic director for a new nonprofit arts organization called Chicago Scriptworks. We were producing staged readings of original screenplays to help workshop these new scripts for up-and-coming writers. And Rob was an actor that we called on frequently to be a part of these staged readings. And as you'll hear in this interview, he was one of the first actors that we worked with that actually had his own website. This comes probably from his corporate background, where he now takes all of that acting and improv training and brings it into his business to, as he says, try to make the world's boardrooms and conference rooms and ballrooms safe again for audiences. And if you like the way that sounds, then that is a perfect example of how Rob coaches his clients to be able to communicate the value of what they're offering in a clear, useful, and entertaining way. I'll be linking, of course, to all of Rob's resources, including his book, in the show notes for this episode at thecreativeimpostor.com/083 for episode 83. And of course, you can link to it from the episode description in whichever app you are using to listen to the show. This is part of our exploration series on voice. And Rob is chock full of tips for anyone who's going to be doing any kind of speaking, whether that be in a public setting, live on stage, or whether that be in a recorded setting, as a podcaster, or even as a podcast interview guest. Tips, technique, strategy, mindset, it is all here for you. So get those pens ready to take some notes with Rob Biesenbach. I'm very curious to have this conversation with you because we met in a completely different context than where we both are now. And that was, I can't even say how many years ago that was.
Mid-2000s at some point, I think. Gosh, long time ago.
Something like that. And I was working on a nonprofit organization called Chicago Scriptworks, and we were producing staged readings of original screenplays to help writers sort of like craft their story, get used to what their dialogue sounded like. And Rob was an actor who we called upon, I feel like, somewhat frequently.
A few times, yeah, which is my pleasure to do. It was a great experience for me.
So tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you're up to these days.
Well, you knew me back then as an actor, and it's interesting when you think about imposter syndrome and all the other things. People get very stuck in their heads about who you are. I've sort of watched your career develop through LinkedIn and social media, but I think it's important for us all to be cognizant people evolve and change, and we put people in pigeonholes and say, this is that person. Andrea is this Scriptworks person, and you're doing much different things now. And I just point that out because my career has evolved quite a bit. Like people get in touch with me later, they're like, oh, I didn't know you were doing that. So I've been in corporate communications as my professional day job ever since graduating college. But in the early 2000s, I started a second career as an actor. I did sketch work, improv, theater, film, commercials. And what I realized eventually was that everything I was learning on stage and in front of the camera could be applied directly to my business clients and corporate communications, connecting with an audience and telling stories, bringing energy to a room. So that became the launching pad for my career as a speaker, as a trainer, and as an author of books on communications. So it's been a fascinating ride.
And so talking about how people's careers change and evolve and go through these different permutations, you hadn't been acting like forever. When I met you, you had recently gotten into the acting side of things. What's the broad overview of how you've sort of wound your way through these different types of communication to being a corporate coach and speaker?
Well, corporate communications was always my real profession ever since leaving college. I was in PR firms, nonprofits, associations, doing corporate communications work. I just had this long time itch that I wanted to perform. I was the baby of the family. I fancied myself the class clown in the office, cut up, but not always with great success. So it was always in the back of my mind, I feel like there's something more creative I can do. And I seized an opportunity. When I went out on my own, I left a big PR firm in the late 90s. And a couple of years into that, I said, I have this flexibility with my time. I'm going to start taking classes at Second City, something I've always sort of thought about. And it just launched everything. It was just such an exciting time of my life.
Improv specifically, right?
Doing improv, starting with improv, then moving to sketch and sketch writing. But, Second City is a very inspiring place. And it was unlike anything I'd ever done before. I think I was in the school play in second grade. I played like Shepherd number 3, carrying an invisible lamb and a staff that my mother made out of a broomstick. So I had no experience in acting. But I think I had somewhat of a knack for a certain kind of acting.
What kind of acting would that be?
Well, I guess more broad acting. When I sort of came to realize that I'm not a great actor was when I was getting into more serious stage work. And I just couldn't get there emotionally like some of my peers could, who maybe were more emotionally available. But if you need somebody who's kind of glib in a commercial or a straight spokesman type or a casual humorous person, I'm good at that. But, I can barely cry in real life, let alone cry on demand for a performance.
So no heavy melodramas or anything like that for you?
Yeah, I got to tell you, every actor has those moments, many moments usually, where they're kind of slapped in the face with reality and saying, what are you doing with your life? Where are you going? And that kind of hit me a couple of times like, I'm good at this and I'm good at certain things, but I'm not going to make my career on this. And what is it all for? And that's when the discovery happened about, I can link these two worlds of mine, the business and the acting. That was such a revelation, and it was so good because it felt like none of that time was wasted. Even though it was challenging and fulfilling and fun, it wasn't just a dead end. It led to where I am now.
And so how are you linking what you learned through all of your acting experience and improv and sketch comedy with business communications and you're working with CEOs, mid-level managers?
Senior executives, usually all kinds of people or teams. I do workshops on presentation skills. I work one-on-one with people. I do speeches on storytelling. So my whole approach is I use lessons from show business to help people succeed in their business.
Because I think sometimes we think business communication, corporate communication, it just immediately, especially if you're somebody who's more creatively minded, you're like, oh, that's so dry. So tell me more about how that applies.
It usually is so dry. So that's why it's a wonderful business opportunity and why there's so many other people beyond me doing this kind of work, because most presentations suck and most presenters, are not great at it. You go to any conference, it's not good. And the odd thing is, we see examples all around us of great presentations like TED Talks and Steve Jobs. And for some reason, people don't internalize these lessons. So I'm trying to make the world's boardrooms and conference rooms and ballrooms safe again for audiences.
And how do you go about doing that? Like, what do you think are some of the common roadblocks or obstacles that you're helping people to move fast, or something that you're helping them to see in a different way in terms of the way that they're presenting?
Number one is to think of their audience first. Too often in a presentation, the first 10 minutes is the person telling us all about themselves and their qualifications. You already got the gig. We came to see you speak. You don't have to prove to us that you're qualified. The one thing that audiences all want to know is, I'm sure you can guess, what's in it for me?
Exactly.
So think first and foremost about what your audience needs and gear your presentation toward them. Other things are bring life to it, put energy behind it. You see these speakers are just sort of dry and detached. You got to live and breathe this stuff and plan it out, rehearse it, time it. Every presentation you see, people look at the clock and say, oh gosh, I've got 70 more slides and only 10 more minutes. And they just breeze through it. It's like, is this the first time you're doing this out loud? So all these things I learned from acting, rehearsing relentlessly, planning, thinking of your audience, inhabiting the character, bringing energy to the room. Those are all critical.
And I think that for somebody like me who has acting training and has theater training and has music training, if you say to bring more energy to it, I can probably think of 1,005 different ways that I could potentially bring some more energy to something. But I don't think that phrase is necessarily clear or makes sense to everyone who may not have that same kind of background or training. So what are some of the ways that you help people to break that down, that task of bringing more energy to their presentation?
Yeah, I tell you, that's one of the biggest challenges to explain to people. It needed to be explained to me. One of my first shows, during the rehearsal, the director kept yelling, Rob, your energy is flagging. Rob, more energy. And finally, he just started screaming energy every couple of minutes. And I'm like, what in the hell is energy? He didn't tell me. So I had to learn it on the streets. And so when I try to translate that for people who aren't trained in acting, energy is really about complete focus. Mentally, you know your content, you are experiencing it as you're saying it, not just going on autopilot. Emotionally, you are feeling invested in it. You believe in it. You're passionate about it. And if you're not passionate about it, don't do the presentation. And physically, you're feeling good. You're up. So if you want to bring energy to a presentation, you might do some stretches beforehand, get the blood circulating, take some deep breaths, get oxygen to your brain, be in the moment, don't check out. Just constantly focus on where you are and what you're doing and what you're saying. Stay connected.
And do you think that doing those kinds of things will naturally affect the sound of your voice or the way that you're actually speaking and communicating? Or are there specific things that you do to work with speakers and presenters around how they're actually speaking or how they're actually delivering the information?
Yeah, well, voice is a big part of it. And a simple energy hack is just to raise your voice a little bit. Everything in a presentation should be slightly larger than life, including your voice. So you don't want to be presenting like this. You want to be presenting like this. So it's a distinct difference. And it's an interesting cycle because the more excited and passionate and into the topic you are, the more your voice will come up. And the more your voice goes up, the more energetic you'll also feel.
And so listeners can't see you right now, but I can see you.
Yeah.
And what's happening as Rob's giving these two different variations of voice is when his voice is more monotone and a little bit quieter, his whole body language changes. The posture shrinks a little bit and his hands are down and the shoulders even kind of slump a little bit. His face has a relaxed look on it. And then as soon as he brings more energy, the shoulders go back, the chest lifts, his hands are moving, his eyebrows are a little bit lifted, everything shifts. Is that something that you're conscious of doing, Rob, or is that just something that happens naturally when you're connecting with a certain message you want to convey?
Acting helped me be more conscious of my body, my expression, my movement. But that's really important. I do an exercise in my workshops where I have people just pair up and talk about something you're really passionate about. And I watch them, and sometimes I record them. And you can see they're moving, they're gesticulating, their expressions are big. Then I tell them, sit on your hands. Don't use your arms, your hands. It actually affects people's ability to communicate when they can't gesture. So it's really about just freeing your body. And there's been a lot of science behind this, that gesture not only is a reflection of how we're feeling, it actually helps prompt our thoughts.
Huh.
Yeah, be big and expansive. Most people say, what do I do with my hands? Am I doing too much of this? I always tell them it's rare that somebody does too much of it. Usually they don't do enough.
Interesting. Is it helpful, do you think, for people to listen to recordings of or see videos of themselves presenting? Do you ever use that as a tool? Or I personally hate watching myself on video. Of course, being a podcaster, I've gotten used to listening to myself on audio, especially because I edit my own episodes. And sometimes, I'll say, why are you talking like that? Or why does your voice sound like that? But watching myself on video is something I dislike strongly. But do you think that can be a useful tool for people?
It's very useful. And that's common. Everybody hates seeing themselves on video. But I use that in my workshops. I have people prepare a mock presentation of a couple of minutes. First, we get comment from their peers in the workshop. We get comment from me. And then they take the video off to another room and they watch it. And I have a diagnostic where they can rate themselves. And it's tough for people, but it's really valuable. What I always warn people is, they say the camera doesn't lie. In some ways, it does lie. It's two-dimensional, literally and figuratively. You can't get the feeling for the room. You can't see how the audience is connecting with you. You just see this flatness. So you're never going to be as good as you think you are in your head. But I always tell people you're better than what you look like on video. So I find video most useful for spotting tics, physical and verbal. Phrases we use, okay, well, and things that we might do, gestures or expressions that might be done too much and be distracting to the audience.
I'm glad you brought up tics or crutch words just now, because I know that as an editor who works with other podcasters, that is something that I edit for. If I have somebody who has a lot of those, and so, those kinds of words. And I try to edit them out and help them out, whether it's the host or the guest who has those. But there is also something to be said in terms of a live presentation and a recorded presentation of learning what yours are and learning how to not do that. Mm-hmm. Because there's two schools of thought. In podcasting land, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, I don't want that stuff edited out. I want it to sound natural. I want it to feel and sound like a natural conversation. And then there's the school of thought that I subscribe to, which is that those kinds of words and vocal tics sort of get in the way of what you're trying to communicate, especially when you're not face-to-face with somebody, when you are in a recorded medium or when you are in a presentational type setting. How do we stop doing that?
That's an important point, how audio can be different for in-person, because I'm not a total dictator on filler words. Because I think the occasional filler word, there's been science that proves that it makes you seem more authentic and real. But if somebody does it a lot, I tell people, if you start to notice it, you're doing it too much, whatever it is, a gesture or a word. So some of the common ways, and I didn't make this up, the common ways to get rid of filler words are, number one, to recognize what your filler words are. So watch yourself, record yourself, be conscious of those. When you're practicing or rehearsing, mentally try to avoid those words, replace them with dead air, so you just not talk, and then eventually you'll get to a point where you'll bridge your ideas together without the use of those. Other things, you can appoint a trusted person, a family member or colleague who will be there to tell you anytime you're using those words. Even a Post-it note. When I go on podcasts, before we went on this, I said, be careful, because what I often do is I answer a question by beginning with well. And at one point, I had a Post-it note with the word well and a cross and a circle around it to avoid doing that.
That's really funny. Okay, so when we're talking about public speaking, live public speaking in front of an audience, and I know I'm kind of going back and forth between recorded mediums and live mediums, but if we're a creative professional, there is some point in which we're going to have to present in front of an audience, most likely. And I always hear that stat or whatever it is that people are more afraid of public speaking than they are of death, right? That's the conventional wisdom that gets thrown around. And I don't know if that's actually true or not. But what do you think it is about public speaking in front of an audience that sometimes trips people up? And even if it's a topic that they feel passionate about, they can completely fall flat because of nerves or because of not feeling prepared or something like that. Like, what do you see most often, and how do we work through those nerves so that we can be more confident as a presenter?
Okay. Yeah, like a lot of conventional wisdom, that one is a myth. There's no reliable studies showing that people fear it more than death. But it is true. Most people will tell you they don't like public speaking. So I take a few approaches to this. Number one, know your audience. Understand who you're talking to. Talk to somebody who knows them. Talk to individuals. The better you know your audience, the less they'll feel like strangers and the more they'll feel like allies. So that's number one. Mm-hmm. Number two, know your stuff. Practice it backwards, forwards, sideways, until you can practically do it in your sleep. The more prepared you are, the more poised you'll be. Take a few deep breaths. Breathing calms us, centers us, grounds us. So that's important to do. And finally, what I tell people, if none of that works, is really just some tough love. Get over yourself. This comes from a place of ego. It's interesting, you'll find professionals who are highly competent in whatever profession they're in. and they wig out over a presentation. So I asked them, well, what do you do? And they say, well, I'm in finance. Okay, so if a balance sheet doesn't quite add up, do you run around the office like your hair's on fire? It's like, oh my God, I'm not, or do you just address the problem and get through it? Well, of course they address the problem and get through it. So some of this is just like, get over it. Pretty much everybody's job is communication at some point. This is something you need to do, and just let go of all that ego and just do it.
Yeah. And so as you were taking all of your experience from the business world, from the corporate communications world, and you were taking all this experience from acting and improv, and you decided to go out on your own and do this consulting, coaching thing, that feels like maybe that was a big risk for you. Did it feel intimidating or scary at all? Or was it just like, oh yeah, obviously this is the next thing I'm going to do?
You know, I'm funny. I'm real easy with big decisions. But if I have to decide on a really small thing, I don't know, like what size shampoo to buy, I'll stand in a store for 5 minutes. But, big decisions, quit my job. So I left Ogilvy PR, top 10 PR firm globally. I left there in 1999. And I would say it wasn't a big risk. Number one, because the big things don't seem to worry me, but also because we were at the height of a booming economy. It didn't feel like a risk. I knew if it didn't work out going out on my own, I could walk down Michigan Avenue and get a job at any other PR firm. So I did it. And I just continued doing the kind of work I did at Ogilvy, corporate communications work, strategy, tactics, all that stuff. Then I merged into the acting, so I was doing both, the corporate communications and the acting in the early 2000s. And then around 2010 is when this idea hit. And I started with the books. I started public speaking, or professionally speaking, workshops. So it's been sort of a natural transition. And I will tell you, I've always been probably a little naive. And if I wasn't naive, I don't think I would have accomplished anything I did. When I started taking classes at Second City, my plan was to get noticed, be elevated to the main stage, and then Lorne Michaels would take me to New York to be on Saturday Night Live.
Of course.
When I wrote my first book, I pictured myself on the old Daily Show. In that last segment, Jon Stewart would be interviewing me about this book. When I started speaking, I started reaching out to speakers bureaus. I wanted to do 50 gigs a year and, for X $1,000 a gig. And, all of that was highly unrealistic. But I think if I'd known the odds, I wouldn't have tackled these things. So in a way, being dumb was really helpful.
This sounds like the opposite of imposter syndrome to me.
Well, I suffer from probably both at different times. But when you don't know something about a subject, it's impossible to know. Same thing when I got frustrated with improv. I thought, well, I'm going to go do theater. And I got hired. I hired cast in my very first show I auditioned for. So I thought, well, in a couple of years, I'll be at Steppenwolf. And, those improv people are really going to be, sorry they let me go.
Right.
Which is ridiculous on its face.
So then where does this idea of imposter syndrome or this feeling of self-doubt or like people might be thinking of you in a different way than how you actually are, where does that show up for you?
That shows up to me most often in networking situations, I would say. Like a lot of creative people, I think like most people, I tend to be somewhat introverted. I don't like making small talk. So those are maybe my biggest moments of discomfort. Again, like a lot of actors, politicians, leaders, they're great on stage, but catch them in an elevator and they don't know what to say. So that's kind of where I feel out of place and not sure, am I boring this person? Should I stop talking? Should I let them move on to somebody else in the room? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Obviously, being self-employed, networking is very important. It's crucial, really, to being successful unless you just have such a huge referral network that it's all inbound marketing.
Yeah.
Right. The dream come true. Mm-hmm. So what do you do with that feeling? Like, how do you go ahead and take those opportunities and present yourself in a confident way, despite how that's feeling?
Well, I think this is where the online world has been such a boon to people like me. You can establish relationships with people online. And so then when you go to a live networking event, you already feel like you know that person. You've conversed on LinkedIn or wherever else. And I think that's really important.
So again, like getting on LinkedIn and finding you again, because there was like a period of time where I didn't know where you went or what you were doing because it's sort of disconnected from that world. But then when I saw your articles and your book and all of the things that you were posting via LinkedIn, one thing that I really liked is how you were bringing in this idea of storytelling into presenting. And I feel that in some cases in the marketing world and then the content world, there's been a strong push towards storytelling. Everyone's like, oh, you have to become a good storyteller. Oh, you have to get into the story. Oh, you have to tell a story with your marketing. Can you say a little something about why story is important and how to integrate that into your communications?
Yeah, it's very important, and it's so hyped. I'm working on a keynote right now. I talk about the rise of the storytelling industrial complex. There's an entire storytelling industry, and story. And people are bombarded with this information. They're like, what do I do? So I just try to really just simplify it and bring it down to earth, because most of my clients don't want to hear about Aristotle and Plato and have a 20-step process. They want to keep it really, really simple. And what a story is simply there's a problem and a solution and a character. So anytime you can bring some of your own experience to any problem, it's like, for instance, instead of citing a bunch of data, you could give an example. And I'm trying to get back to your question about, okay, how do you apply this? When I'm pitching business and somebody's having an issue, I immediately, this reminds me of a client just like you. They were facing this particular issue, and this is how we solved it. When I'm doing a presentation, one of my biggest presentations on presentation skills, I do two different ones. Sometimes I talk about the worst presentation I ever saw, which inspired me to write the book, 11 Deadly Presentation Sins. Sometimes I write about the worst presentation I ever gave. In both of those, people will remember the story much more than they'll remember all the data. And there's actually tons of data about storytelling. So I try to use stories to illustrate the importance of storytelling and why it's more effective and why it sticks.
What was the worst presentation you ever gave?
Oh, gosh. I was working in the Ohio Attorney General's office. I was the press secretary. Somebody did something really dumb. We were responsible for the office's image. And one of the lawyers said something he shouldn't have said to a reporter. Somebody said, well, you should talk to the senior staff. The big senior staff meeting is next week. And so I came loaded with bear, and I gave less of a presentation than just a rant. And it was silly because I made so many mistakes. I didn't plan. I winged it. I was too emotional. I joked around. It was a very serious topic, and I think I joked because I was probably not confident in my message. So my boss's boss grabbed me by the arm. She was the chief of staff, and she said, you are really bad at this. You need to take some public speaking classes. So ironically, I've never taken a public speaking class, and now I give them. So I learned about speaking by helping hundreds of executives with their speeches and then eventually being a speaker myself.
Wow, that's pretty... Yeah. That was pretty intense.
It was intense.
What advice do you have for somebody who is trying to navigate the way that they present themselves in public? Maybe they're just feeling like, I don't know if anyone is really going to want to listen to me. I don't really know if I have what it takes. I don't know if I can do this keynote presentation. What are some of the best pieces of advice if someone's feeling really unsure of themselves?
I'd say number one, just clarify who you are. It's a big part of finding your voice. Like, what do you do? Why do you do it? Who do you help? And how do you do it differently or better than others? So I've done that with people. Like, they come to me with, here's my career. How do I put this into compelling 100 words in LinkedIn? I help them craft really their story of who they are. So I guess knowing yourself is number one, knowing what you're good at, feeling good about it, and being prepared to tell your story. Because too often we'll meet somebody at a networking event and say, oh, what do you do? It's, oh, well, I guess I produce videos and stuff. No, I say, try to find a catchy way to say that. People ask me what I do. One of the things I say is, well, if you've ever attended a really awful presentation, I'm trying to put an end to that. And they go, oh, how are you doing that? Well, I provide training and consulting and books. I help people become more confident and powerful, persuasive presenters. So having a way to engage people, packaging yourself, I guess. I'd say one of my greatest strengths as an actor was my ability to package myself. I had a website before any actor had a website. I had,
That's true. I remember your website.
Yeah. So my background in communications and marketing, it helped me. But sadly, Steppenwolf won't cast you based on your ability to how well you package yourself.
Does word choice have a lot to do with that packaging?
Yeah, well, one of the things I try to get people to avoid is meaningless language and jargon and biz speak, empower and synergies and all of that stuff. And just to write in the way they speak, in a natural, authentic way that's understandable to people. So I guess that's the number one thing I would say on language. And expressing yourself powerfully instead of hedging and say kinda, sort of. I think one of the most important things in our professional and personal development is getting to a place in your life where you know your strengths and you know your weaknesses. So you're not apologetic about either of them. Because you can't be good at everything, but there are certain things you do well, and you don't have to be shy about it. You don't have to be, egotistical about, I do this so well. But, I say, one of the things I really do well is this, or one of the things I hear from clients is they say they can bring me just a bunch of stuff, and I'm able to assemble it into a coherent narrative. And I think that's where I really thrive.
Is that a useful tool to ask your clients what you do well for them or what they say you do well and to sort of see what their answers are?
That's a good question. Well, I hear it. I guess I don't often seek it, but I get evaluations all the time from my speaking and keynotes and workshops on my books and Amazon reviews. So I feel like I got a pretty good sense of that. A couple of the recent reviews, it's hard. You read the review and somebody gave me like a 3-star review, which I shouldn't be upset about, but they said, I expected a much longer book with a lot more examples, and that bothered me. Yeah. And I reminded myself, I write business books for people like me who hate business books. They are short. This is like 176 pages. It is to the point, and it's not a bunch of academic, theoretical nonsense. It is straight and to the point.
It sounds like kind of what you're saying throughout all of this is that the first key thing or the underlying key thing is just to really know yourself and be confident in who you are and what you have to offer. And then everything else just sort of flows from there.
Yeah, because you can remind yourself, well, I am this, I'm not that. I am not an academic writer. I'm not going to write a 400-page book. That's not me. And I think in terms of development, some people get it early on. Most people, it takes a long time to figure out who you are. Because when you're younger, you're wrapped up in peer pressure and what society demands and the images you see of how you're supposed to be. And it's really hard to cut through all that and figure out, okay, this is really who I am. I wish I had a shortcut for it, but I don't.
A shortcut for finding out who you are.
Yeah. It's tough.
Rob, is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners today about speaking, about being confident in your voice, about imposter syndrome, or anything else?
I would say don't be so hard on yourself. I've heard from other professional speakers, people at the top of their game, keynoters are making $30,000 a speech, who say they get nervous before a speech. Everyone's human. Everybody has something they don't like about themselves. So learn as much as you can to not let that stuff get you down and just understand that you're human and you have a lot to offer.
I just love what Rob said about getting to a place in your life where you know your strengths and you know your weaknesses, and you're not apologetic about either one of them. I super appreciate all of the insights that he shared with us, tips, tricks, resources, hacks, strategies. Oh my gosh. And I would love to get your feedback about this episode or anything that Rob shared. Join me over in the Creative Impostor Facebook group to become part of the conversation around voice. And come follow me on LinkedIn at Andrea Klunder, where I'm posting articles, queries, etc. around how we as content creators can use our voice more effectively. This series was inspired by a panel talk that I am facilitating at She Podcasts Live in October 2019 in Atlanta, Georgia, all around voice and podcasting. If you haven't gotten your ticket for She Podcasts Live yet, there may still be a handful left, and you can find out more at thecreativeimpostor.com/She Podcasts Live. Also, if you happen to be a podcaster listening to this episode, or you're dreaming of being a podcaster, don't forget, I have another show, and it's all about, you guessed it, podcasting. You can search for Podcast Envy anywhere that you are listening to The Creative Impostor. Special thanks to Edwin Ruiz of Mondo Machine for mixing this episode and making it sound lovely, and to Jovia Armstrong for providing our incredible theme music. Special thanks goes to you for listening and being a part of the Creative Impostor community. And this week, I am wishing you the courage to just completely let go of that ego and get out there and do your job with your voice, which is communication.